Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to be talking about revitalization of urban areas through the use of collaborative design. My guest today is Alan Pullman. Mr. Pullman is the Senior Principal Architect and the founder of a design firm called Studio 111. Welcome, Alan, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Thank you.
Okay, well, before we get started defining what we mean by collaborative design and get into the details of that, perhaps you could tell us just a little bit, a brief overview of what Studio 111 does and why did you form this company?
So I founded Studio 111 in the year 2000, and it really was focused on urban repair. We call ourselves a collaborative practice, an integrated practice of architecture with urban design and landscape design. And I formed it because actually I was living here in Long Beach and had a chance to work on some community revitalization projects. And I found that really it was sort of my calling to really figure out how we can revitalize existing cities and work on existing places and really help them become better places for our community.
And what are some of the projects that you've been working on very quickly?
We've worked on a lot of streetscape improvements in the city. We've introduced parklets, which are elements that really help create more walkable and vibrant streets. We've done a lot of community revitalization and rehabilitation, and a lot of it is on a smaller scale rather than a big project where we're tearing down blocks of the city and starting from scratch. We go and use existing buildings. Some of our projects are at 4th and Linden, which is a district that we've been working on for several years, rehabbing buildings, building new buildings, and then bringing in independent and local retailers and businesses into the community. We're currently relocating our offices here in downtown, taking the old City Place project and turning it back into a part of the fabric of the city.
And Alan, when we talk about urban revitalization, I mentioned that we're connecting the concept of collaborative design into that process. Now, traditionally, when we think about architecture or talk about architecture, we're actually envisioning these iconic buildings made by or designed by superstar architects like Frank Lloyd Wright. Here in Southern California, we had an architect by the name of Paul Revere Williams, who did a number of iconic buildings and also became known as the designer for the movie stars in terms of architecture. But what we're talking about in terms of collaborative design actually takes the focus off of the actual architect, and we're no longer talking about superstar architects. What are we talking about?
Well, there's kind of a new thinking about how we're approaching revitalizing cities. We're not building from scratch. We're in a built-out area. We have certain kind of key issues. We already have people living in these areas. We have to get their input. They're going to be living with the results of any interactions that we have with the city. And so what we're really doing is talking about a community participation component that wasn't there before. We're really very keen on making sure that the inhabitants and the stakeholders in the community are really directing us of what we should do. We also are dealing with other issues that are not just design issues, sustainability, livability, social issues, as well as the key environmental issues. Those are the kind of issues that really require a much more collaborative, holistic approach.
And we're going to talk about those in a moment, those different approaches. But when we talk about revitalizing urban areas, most people think we're talking about old buildings, buildings that were built in the 1920s or 30s or 40s. But in fact, you have done some projects, I know in downtown LA, where you've taken buildings that were built in probably the 1970s or so and renovated those as well. And most of us don't think a 40-year-old building is really all that old, but sometimes you need to redesign and renovate those as well. So why is it necessary to redesign buildings that were built maybe only 30 or 40 years ago?
Well, a great example is the project we're doing downtown Los Angeles, where we're renovating a building that was built in the 70s. It's obsolete in the sense that it was built at a time when we had a certain thinking about the city, and it was built as a fortress that actually held the city out, didn't connect with the city, because there was a lot of fear about what happens in an urban population, and let's keep people safe and disconnected from the activity of the street. We have a totally different thinking about urbanism now, where we realize that's actually counterproductive to making a safer environment. We have to connect to the street. We have to make linkages to the street. We have to open it up so people want to be there. And so it's really, the framework of the building is great, but we had to reconceptualize it for the way we think about cities and urbanism today.
Well, since I mentioned that urban revitalization tends to involve older buildings, that's also true. I mean, we need to acknowledge that. And so when we're talking about these older buildings, and I know that earthquake retrofitting is a factor in a lot of these buildings, but also just in terms of what's the most sustainable way to move forward in terms of environmental conservation and energy, green building and so forth. I know a lot of people are pushing the green building program for new construction. So is it better from an environmental standpoint to just knock down the old buildings and start from scratch with a green building that will have some sort of zero net energy impact? Or can we actually be environmentally sustainable by renovating the older buildings?
Well, there are a lot of studies, Dave, that really talk about the environmental benefit of reusing older buildings. Preservation Green Lab is a group that actually does a lot of studies on that. And if you can take an existing building and reuse it, upgrade the energy systems to be more sustainable and more efficient, there's a great savings in terms of the embodied energy of the building and the material usage of the building that really gives a benefit for reusing older buildings. There's a lot of reasons to reuse older buildings. We're big proponents of that.
Okay, and as we talk about these older buildings and the collaborative design process, you mentioned that the folks that live in the neighborhood have a say. And they actually, in some cases, you've had the local residents vote on projects. How does that work exactly?
Well, again, we're really proponents of community participation, whether it's a workshop or a charrette, which is a process where the community comes together and works in a diligent, kind of intensive fashion to come up with their ideas, using social media and different kind of social media platforms to get input from the community. Every city is really moving to understanding they've really got to involve the citizens in decisions that really are going to affect their lives, both now and into the future, for these to be sustainable and implementable.
And so what we're really talking about here is a term known as bottom-up architecture as opposed to top-down architecture, which did involve the superstar architects that we talked about earlier. So when we talk about bottom-up architecture and design, are we really talking about the leading edge of a social revitalization effort?
It's been going on for a while, but I definitely think that people are understanding the importance of involving the community, of having the community participate in not only the design of the project, but initiating projects as well. And when we talk about bottom up, we look at the community as the experts, rather than the experts coming down in from the top saying, this is what you need. Really getting the knowledge and the embedded information from the community to inform any decision about what's going to happen in their city.
And when we talk about the community having a stake or having a voice in where they're going to live and where they're going to possibly work, and certainly where they're going to be doing their shopping and so on, we have to talk about the economic factors as well. There is a rent gap, what they call the rent gap in Southern California, where people's incomes and the rent they have to pay, there's a lack of balance there. So when we talk about the economics, how does that play into this collaborative design process?
Well, you know, when we talk about sustainability, we talk about environmental issues, but we also talk about social issues and economic issues. And we do have large issues about differing economic situations. You know, affordability in Southern California, example, is becoming less and less affordable to live in Southern California coastal cities. I'm kind of humble about that. Those are really large societal problems that we're trying to face. We, as a practice, always preach that the most important thing to do with affordability, maintain existing affordable units. Building new is great, but it's important to maintain what's existing and affordable. So when we go into an area, we want to make sure that we're not taking down affordable units and replacing it, for instance, with much more expensive luxury apartments.
So really what we're talking about here is making sure that we don't bulldoze down the whole block just because it would be nice to have new structures. We want to incorporate what we can, utilize what exists, maybe help to integrate it into the overall design of the neighborhood a little bit better. But you really are looking at maintaining what we have, improving it if possible, and then building new wherever that is necessary. So when we talk about the urban environment today, Are there some changes occurring in terms of lifestyle? We hear about the millennials as one group that seems to be more interested in a communal lifestyle where they're closer to the urban center, where they're able to walk city streets to get from work to shopping to restaurants and so on. What about that? Are we seeing some demographic trends that are helping to push this whole process?
Well, the millennials are the largest, population group that's really driving a lot of real estate right now. And we definitely are seeing changes in their lifestyle patterns. We don't know exactly why it is. It's pretty complicated. It could be effects of the economic recession that make house buying something that's more difficult. But they are delaying house buying. They're moving into urban centers. They're delaying having families and buying homes, and instead focusing on their career. But we do see that as a large trend in this urban renaissance, I would call it, in a lot of our cities.
And walkability is a term that's becoming very prominent today in real estate. And there's a real estate company called Redfin, which puts out a walkability score rating system for cities. And they use a software algorithm that measures walking paths. It measures distance from housing to services such as restaurants, shops, grocery stores where you can obtain those vital amenities and so on. And they put out a listing of the top 50 cities every year, and the top 50 cities of over 300,000 population. And as it happened in 2016, Long Beach came in 10th in the nation, which was kind of surprising to people, but it has happened. Number 1, of course, is New York. Number 2 is San Francisco. 3 is Boston, and 4 is Philadelphia. But to be in the top 10 is an impressive accomplishment. Why is that happening here in Long Beach?
Well, I mean, it is great, right? And we use WalkScore a lot. We promote it a lot because it really puts Long Beach in a great light in terms of walkability. A lot of Long Beach was established in the 20s and 30s, so it actually has a street grid, not all of the city, but a lot of the city, that really makes it very walkable, tight, small blocks, and a lot of connection between different destinations, and that's what gives you a really good walk score. So it's really set up to be a wonderful walking city. And I think our whole paradigm of everyone getting in a car moving is slowly, well, actually not that slowly, it's actually changing quite a bit.
Well, we're going to talk more about traffic and mobility issues in Southern California in just a moment, but we have to take a break. So when we come back, we'll talk about those issues, and we'll take a look at some of the images of Alan's recent work. Stay with us.
Make a difference in our future by researching and helping to preserve our natural resources. The wide variety of careers in this field will have a huge impact on our lives while using the principles of engineering, chemistry, and biology to help find solutions to environmental problems. You could be a part of this exciting field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Hello and welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Alan Pullman. Alan, before we went to the break, we just started to get into the issue of traffic and parking problems in our dense urban areas. And Los Angeles, of course, is known as one of the worst in terms of parking and traffic. It certainly has that reputation, and it's well deserved. So how do we deal with the issue of parking and housing and providing places for people to live so that the city itself is sustainable in terms of mobility? Where do we start that process?
Well, it's a challenge because we have a region that's already built out, and it's built out mostly along the lines of transportation, which is single-use automobiles. Even though in the country we're the 3rd highest mass transit use, which a lot of people don't realize. What we're trying to do is overlay a new transportation paradigm on the communities that we have here, and that's a challenge. But I think that there are changes coming. Some of them are technological. We have a lot of discussion going on about autonomous vehicles, we call them AV, and how that's really going to change transportation uses. We have technology that allows us to do parking in a much more efficient way, which is called automated parking. Our parking systems are very inefficient. Do you know that parking a car, you only use it probably 5% of the time. So that means 95% of the time a car is just sitting in a parking space. We have to use our existing resources in a much more efficient way.
And one of the complaints I hear from people that do live in Los Angeles is that, you know, what used to take 15 minutes 30 years ago now takes 45 minutes in terms of moving from point A to point B. And then when I get to point B, I have to spend another 10 or 15 minutes driving around the block 3 times until a spot opens up. So are we going to be able to address those kinds of issues?
I think we have to. I mean, if we're going to continue to grow, and I think there's an economic reason to say that there is growth that should happen, if we're going to continue to build housing so that it can become or maintain some level of affordability, we have to grow. So we're going to have to start to address those issues. Part of it is building more transportation infrastructure in the form of light rail and other kind of subway systems that Metro is proposing. Another is, again, using technology in a way to make getting around a little bit easier. But with growth and good urbanism, these are issues that do come up, and it's up to us as a community to figure out solutions. I think just putting a cap on all development is probably not the way to go.
When we talk about the walkability issue that we discussed in the first segment, it's not possible for every city and every community to have a top walkability score. There are urban areas that can achieve that because of the nature of how they were designed in the first place, but a lot of people still want to live in suburban areas that are more quiet, that are more single-family oriented with front yards and backyards and things of that nature. So on that note, the Redfin scoring system on construction of new homes talks about the neighborhoods or the cities that are not exactly walkable. And one of those is Irvine. Irvine's a beautiful city here in Southern California in Orange County, but there's a lot of construction there that goes into housing tracts which are not considered very walkable. There's nothing wrong with living in a suburban area that doesn't have a high walkability score. It's all about choices, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I started my practice, we were working on housing, and no one was really building urban housing for people that wanted to live in a tight urban condition like downtown Los Angeles or even downtown Long Beach. And it's been a sea change in thinking about building that for a population, and people really want it. But still, a lot of people still want a suburban environment as well. So it's really about the fact that now we're building we're giving people choices. We're building for the market, and the market is asking for both urban and suburban solutions.
And when we talk about urban and suburban solutions, we're also talking about, with environmental sustainability, much more emphasis on going green. And when we talk about going green, we're actually talking about urban farming. Tell us a little bit about urban farming, and I think you have an image here that we can show from the Long Beach Senior Arts Colony that helps exemplify this. Please.
Well, it's part of a larger kind of a shift where we're decentralizing certain things, and so cities are actually really proposing and promoting farming within the city. You could go to some of the restaurants here in Long Beach and you could see a salad and you can know exactly where that lettuce was grown. It was just grown up the street. In our Senior Arts Colony project, which is on Long Beach and Anaheim, it's a senior affordable project. It's urban. It's on a transit line, so it's transit oriented. And it really brings seniors into the city, gives them the ability to live in an urban environment, which we're finding out a lot of seniors really like. But the other component is we've created gardens right on the podium above the parking there for them to do their own gardening, which is both therapeutic and it actually has a great benefit that they could grow vegetables and plants and flowers that are part of living in an urban environment but connecting to nature.
You've got some other images of work that you're doing that we'd like to show here. The next one is from 4th and Linden. There's a project there. What is that project all about?
So that's a project that we initiated with a bunch of other community-minded developers to take a series of obsolete and sort of rundown buildings in an area where there was no street life and repurpose them for office, for retail. and bring in local tenants, independent tenants, bring in businesses from out of town that want to be there. We create this really wonderful kind of environment. And it's really been a great success. It's catalyzed a portion of downtown to really now have even more development. So the latest piece of that is we're developing a mixed-use building on the corner there, which is going to include apartments above retail.
And I think the Berlin Bistro is part of that as well. Tell us about the Berlin Bistro.
That was one of the independent retailers, a great proponent of the city who owned Portfolio Cafe, opened up a bistro there. We brought in Fingerprints, which was a great music store in Long Beach, and we brought them into that space as well. So it's really about this smaller, organic type of development, but very rooted in Long Beach. And I think that's a kind of trend we see, development that's rooted in a place that really creates a sense of place versus this, it could be anywhere type of development.
And you've got an example of a parklet. In this case, it's called Lola's Mexican Cuisine Parklet. Tell us what that is.
So that was the first parklet that was built in Southern California. And a parklet really is just an extension of the sidewalk into what was a parking space. And really the reasons we did that were traffic calming. We wanted to create streets, and we did 4th Street as the first example, and the city was really behind this. In terms of slowing traffic and creating a more pedestrian environment, the parklet really takes a little bit of parking away, but we replaced all the parking we lost through restriping, but it creates energy on the street. Sidewalk dining is something you walk through European cities or some of the back east cities, and you see how invigorating it is onto the sidewalk. And that was the first one. It's since exploded, and one of the reasons is it's a great economic benefit for the restaurants that support that and pay for it, because it expands their dining, it gives them presence on the street, it lets them hire more people and serve more patrons.
You have another example of a parklet called the At Last Cafe Parklet. Is that along the same lines?
Exactly. And that one actually is a combination of multiple things. It's a bulb out and it's at the At Last Cafe, but it also allows water filtration and biofiltration, so it's actually cleaning the street as well. So it's a really complicated, very forward-thinking parklet.
And you're doing work in other parts of Southern California, not just Long Beach, but as you mentioned earlier, you're working in downtown Long Beach, but you're all, downtown Los Angeles. And you also have a project in West Hollywood known as the Lot Formosa South. Tell us about that.
So that we've done a lot of work in the city of West Hollywood, and the Lot is a independent movie studio that we had a chance to come up with a master plan. The whole goal of that is to re-envision what a 21st century entertainment campus could be. So we're building new buildings, renovating old buildings, historic buildings and new buildings together. It's kind of a very rich environment that's very, very attractive to emerging entertainment companies.
And let's come back to Long Beach for the Children Today EcoHouse. What's involved with that?
That's a renovation of a small commercial building into a school for homeless children, and we're really proud of that project. We've also worked on the Long Beach Airport and Ronald McDonald House. A big part of our practice is really doing community enhancing projects. That's one of our latest ones.
So we're talking about seamlessly incorporating design into the fabric of the community, essentially. And you said that this is a movement that's been growing for a number of years. How does what we're doing today differ from what we referred to as urban gentrification starting about 30 years ago in cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia, for example?
Well, again, I think a big part of it is that we are engaging the community wherever we can in a more thoughtful way into what happens. And we're not clear-cutting slums. Urban renewal was a term that was used before, and it really meant displacing the existing people that were living there and replacing it with new development. Often it didn't work. What we're really trying to do is enhance the place for both new people but the existing population.
So when we talk about urban gentrification from 30 years ago, we often were talking about pushing some people out to bring in newer people that had more money who could fix up the buildings. And so we're changing that paradigm now. So we're allowing the folks that live there to, as you mentioned earlier, have a vote and a voice in what their community will be like. And you're also taking into account their economic and social circumstances. So in that way, you are sort of an organic builder. And I think you mentioned that it's faster, cheaper, more efficient, or something along those lines. This is similar to what's going on in Europe these days. I know there's a firm in the Netherlands, which is looking at what's called urban renaissance. What do you know about that kind of process?
Well, I think we've always felt that it's important to improve a place, but you want to do it with the least amount of physical alterations as possible. There's a movement, there's lots of different terminology for it. Some people call it tactical urbanism, and some people call it lighter, faster, cheaper. But it's making changes without huge amounts of infrastructure improvement, huge amounts of money, but slowly, organically making changes to cities. And we're very excited about that. I think parklets are a good example of that kind of movement, where we're changing the street with not a huge amount of investment, but a small amount of investment, but really a large impact for that investment.
There are some people watching this show that may say, I yearn for the old days of iconic buildings and magnificent architecture. We're not saying that we have to sacrifice that entirely to renovate or revitalize the urban area. We're just saying that there are different uses, different choices, as we talked about. So is there still room for the iconic buildings and the structures that stimulate the senses?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we all want those monuments to creativity in our city. They're really important parts of the city. But you also want the parts of the city that connect, that have a cohesion to them, that relate to the context. And a great city has both.
We only have about 30 seconds left, Alan. The time has really flown by. So in those 30 seconds or so, what about the future? What does the future look like for Southern California?
I think we have some challenges, but I really think that if we just climb the hill step by step, we're going to create a greener, more socially connected, and livable place in the future.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.